He showed up wearing torn khakis and a name tag, and they laughed at him. What they didn't know. He owned the building, the desks, the coffee machine, and even their paychecks. But he didn't say a word yet. This is the true story of how one black billionaire CEO went undercover in his own company, and uncovered a racist conspiracy buried deep within. Hit the like button if injustice makes your blood boil, and subscribe for more stories that unveil truth hidden beneath power. He walked through the glass doors of Carter Tech at exactly 7:48 a.m. hood up, head down, blending in. No one noticed him. Not the receptionist scrolling through her phone, not the security guard sipping his third coffee of the morning. That was perfect. The man's name tag read J. Carter, but no one knew the truth. Because J wasn't just some new warehouse hire looking to punch a clock. He was Julian Elijah Carter, the billionaire founder and CEO of Carter Tech, a data analytics firm worth over $4 billion. A man who had once stood in the Oval Office. Who had been named one of Forbes 30 under 30 before he was 25. And yet, today, he stood on the basement floor of his own company, invisible. It hadn't always been this way. For most of his life, Julian was the exception to every rule. The prodigy. The one they allowed in, because he was brilliant enough to make them look good. But lately, something had changed. He felt it in the culture, in the numbers. One by one, the company's black employees were disappearing. Resigning. Getting fired. Getting squeezed out for reasons no one could quite explain. Julian had reviewed the reports. In the last 6 months alone, 5 high-performing black team leads were let go, most of them without formal warning. He had asked for explanations from the board. What he got were buzzwords and polished lies. So, he stopped asking. He made a decision no one saw coming: he would vanish from the corner office, and return through the back door. He applied for a role through a shell resume, using a variation of his name that no one in the company would recognize. The disguise was simple: a hoodie, scuffed work boots, khakis one size too big. No Rolex. No luxury sedan. Just Jay, another face in the crowd. The receptionist barely glanced up when he approached her desk that morning. Back room. Orientation, she muttered, pointing with a painted fingernail. Jay thanked her quietly, then disappeared down the hall. Inside the orientation room, 4 new hires were already seated. 2 white men, both loud and confident. A Latina woman who barely looked old enough to rent a car. And a young black man who sat stiffly in the corner, nervously tugging at the collar of his polo. Jay sat quietly, folding his hands. He could already feel the room's division. It was unspoken, but thick in the air. A woman in business casual walked in and introduced herself as Carla from HR. She greeted the group with a practiced smile, the kind worn by people who've given the same speech too many times. "Welcome to Carter Tech," she chirped. "We're a family here. But a high-performance one. We value excellence. We reward hard work. And we don't tolerate slacking. Sound good?" There was a murmur of agreement. Carla's eyes lingered a beat too long on the black man in the corner. "Let's go around and introduce ourselves," she said. "Name, background, what you're hoping to achieve here." When it came to Jay's turn, he kept it simple. Jay Carter. Used to work logistics at Horizon Solutions. Just trying to learn the ropes and grow. "Good luck with that," the man beside him mumbled. Brad White, hair slicked back with enough gel to survive a storm, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "I had a Horizon guy on my team last year. Couldn't scan a box without screwing up." A few people chuckled. Jay just smiled and nodded. Let it go. Let them talk. He wasn't here for validation. He was here for truth. His first assignment sent him to Sublevel 2, the warehouse logistics floor. No windows, no carpet, no sunlight. Just the whir of forklifts and the sting of fluorescent light. His supervisor was Doug, a barrel-chested man with a permanent scowl and a voice like sandpaper. "You're the new one," Doug said, eyeing Jay like he was inspecting produce. "Here's how it works. No phones. No standing around. You screw up, I report you. You breathe funny, I report you." Jay nodded. "You got a problem with that?" Doug barked. "No, sir. Didn't think so." He was assigned to shadow Mason, a tall man with a gut that bulged against his uniform and a grin that never reached his eyes. Mason didn't offer a handshake. "Stay out of my way, rookie. You slow me down, you'll regret it." Jay followed without complaint. They spent the next 5 hours moving boxes, scanning inventory, reshelving mislabeled crates. It was brutal work, physically exhausting. Jay's back ached, his shoulders burned. Every now and then, Mason would throw in a jab. "You people act like hard work's a prison sentence," Mason muttered once, loud enough for a nearby worker to snort laugh. Jay didn't flinch. He'd been through worse. But deep down, the comment stung. Not because it was new but because it was so expected. Lunch break came at noon. Jay walked into the break room carrying a peanut butter sandwich and a bottle of water. The room had no posted rules, but it was divided nonetheless. On the left, the white workers gathered around one table, laughing loudly. On the right, the few workers of color sat quietly or alone. Jay chose a corner. As he unwrapped his sandwich, he noticed a younger black employee glance his way, then looked down quickly. Fear. That silent, generational fear of association. Jay didn't blame him. Across the room, Brad and Mason were holding court. "I heard HR hired 2 more DEI hires last month," Brad said, biting into his turkey wrap. "At this rate, we'll be holding meetings in Swahili." Laughter. "I heard one made it into engineering. Must have aced the how to play the race card test." More laughter. Jay pulled out his phone and quietly hit record. Let the snake speak. The rest of the day passed in silence. Jay kept his head down, soaking in every word, every sideways glance. After hours, while the building emptied out, he took the opportunity to explore. He knew the layout better than anyone. He'd designed the damn place. He found the lesser-used conference rooms, the break closets, the ducts. And one by one, he placed tiny devices, voice recorders, pinhole cameras. Tools he'd once ordered for cybersecurity audits. Now used for something far more personal. Back in his rented apartment that night, Jay pored over Cartertech's internal databases. He accessed hidden performance files using old administrator codes. Files the public HR team didn't even know existed anymore. What he found turned his stomach. 3 of the black employees recently terminated: Marcus Fields, Denise Miller, and Todd McKinney had spotless records. All 3 had been rated exceeds expectations just 1 quarter before being let go. Their official dismissals cited cultural misalignment and inability to integrate with team norms. Jay stared at the screen. The signatures at the bottom of each termination. Edward Langston. His uncle. A man who sat quietly on the board. A man who had once shaken his hand at his college graduation and whispered, "You're the future of this family." A man who now might be trying to erase that future piece by piece. Jay leaned back in his chair. It wasn't just about racism anymore. It was personal. The next morning, he returned to work. More heavy lifting. More smirks. More muttered comments under breath. He endured them all. Because each comment was a confession. Each slur, a testimony. Each act of casual cruelty, a piece of the puzzle. That night, he stood before his mirror, sweat-stained, exhausted, sore. This was not the man the world saw. Not the billionaire with the private jet. Not the tech mogul featured in Inc. magazine. This was just a black man, trying to reclaim a company being stolen from under his nose. He stared at his own reflection. Then pressed play on the recording he captured in the break room. Brad's voice echoed from the tiny speaker. "They don't belong here. But Langston's cleaning house. Soon, it'll be our company again." Jay smiled tight-lipped, controlled. "They're right," he whispered. "It will be ours again. But not the way they think." He clicked save on the file, labeled it, Confession 001. And the hunt began. The break room had no cameras. No supervisors. No pretense. That's why it was dangerous. To most, it was just a place to eat soggy sandwiches and stare into microwaves. But for Jay Carter, the man they thought was just another temp, it had become something far more useful, a confession booth. A place where careless words slipped from reckless mouths. And today, those mouths were particularly loud. Brad leaned back in his chair, tossing a plastic spoon into his yogurt container like a game of darts. "Did you hear about Troy?" he asked the table of white coworkers. Mason chuckled. "Yeah. HR finally canned him. Tired of his attitude." Jay looked up from his sandwich. Troy Jenkins had been the quiet black employee he noticed during orientation, smart, observant, always early. Barely 3 weeks into the job, and he was already gone. "What happened?" someone else asked. Brad shrugged. "The usual. Didn't mesh. Wasn't a cultural fit. You know what that means." More laughter. Jay clenched his jaw and kept chewing. They didn't know he'd seen Troy that very morning, being escorted out by 2 security guards, his badge deactivated. No warnings. No emails. No formal notice. Just gone. Jay waited until the others left, then slipped into the hallway and found the janitor's closet, his new audio lab. Inside, he opened the recorder and played back the lunchroom conversation. Clear. Loud. Dangerous. He labeled it, Confession 002. Then he added it to the growing folder on his encrypted flash drive. 2 weeks in, and he had over a dozen recordings already. Microaggressions. Overt slurs. Plans whispered behind locked doors. And yet, something still felt incomplete. The racism was obvious. But what was the plan? He needed more. The next day, Mason was unusually quiet. Instead of barking orders, he handed Jay a clipboard without insult. A few others nodded at him, no smiles, just acknowledgement. Something had shifted. At first, Jay wondered if someone had figured him out. But then, he saw it. A man in a gray suit, walking the floor. Tall. White. Silver hair. A posture that spoke of power. Edward Langston, his uncle, that he wasn't supposed to be on this floor. Jay turned his back quickly, pretending to rearrange a shelf of routers. But he watched through the reflection of the glass display. Edward wasn't here for a tour. He was pointing. Asking questions. Talking to Doug. Doug nodded. Then motioned directly toward Jay. Jay froze. But Edward didn't approach. Instead, he smiled, and walked away. Jay's heart pounded. Had he been recognized? No. He looked different now, thinner beard, deeper tan, contacts instead of glasses. No one had seen this version of him in over a decade. Still, the encounter rattled him. After work, he pulled up the building's internal surveillance system, another tool only a CEO would know how to access. He scrubbed through the footage. Edward had arrived at 9:13 a.m., spent 7 minutes on the logistics floor, then entered conference room 4B. A locked room typically reserved for private meetings. Jay zoomed in on the hallway camera. Edward wasn't alone. With him was Carla from HR. And someone from legal. He played the audio from the hallway mic, soft, muffled, but usable. Pattern must be maintained. We can't let the board notice anything. Handle it quietly, Edward's voice said. Carla nodded. Understood. I'll move the next batch through voluntary attrition. Good. Less messy that way. Jay sat in silence. Next batch. They were talking about people, like products. He saved the footage, copied the audio. Labeled it, Confession 003. Then he stared at the screen for a long time. His own blood was orchestrating a silent purge of black employees and disguising it as performance metrics. Later that week, Jay was reassigned to inventory auditing. It was a step up on paper. In reality, it was isolating. Long hours in the cold storage room, entering serial numbers into a tablet that hadn't been updated in years. But it gave him access to something he hadn't expected, company tablets, dozens of them. Most were wiped. But one, left unlocked by accident, still had browsing history. And inside that browsing history, a link to a private Slack group. Liberty_circle_CTech. Jay clicked. Password protected. He copied the link and sent it to his external network analyst, an old friend from MIT who owed him a favor, and who still didn't know the full truth about why he was asking. 2 hours later, the analyst responded with a decrypted archive. Jay opened it, and what he saw drained the warmth from his chest. The Liberty Circle wasn't just a Slack group. It was a coordinated internal chat channel involving 14 Carter Tech employees, mostly mid-level managers and directors. All white. All verified. And the messages? They weren't jokes. They were strategies. Push him toward burnout. He's one of the loud ones. Let's recommend Troy for that bogus culture realignment program Langston approved it last quarter. Make sure the next DEI hire reports to Mason. That'll accelerate things. Jay couldn't breathe. These weren't just toxic conversations. They were blueprints for racial cleansing done with smiles, performance reviews, and HR protocols. He read every line, screenshot every page, archived the channel before anyone noticed. Labeled it, Confession 004. A few days later, Jay found himself eating lunch alone again. He didn't mind anymore. It gave him time to observe. That's when he noticed her, Ava Gaines, a systems engineer 2 floors up. Young, black, maybe late 20s. She walked into the break room with a stack of files and a look of panic in her eyes. She barely touched her food. When her phone buzzed, she looked around nervously before answering in a whisper. I already submitted it, she said. What do you mean it's been flagged? Silence. But that wasn't even my project. Are they trying to set me up? More silence. Her eyes widened. No, please. I'll come explain. Just please don't escalate this to HR. I can fix it. She hung up and left quickly. Jay followed her out with his eyes, then checked the wall camera once she exited. He made a mental note, Ava Gaines. Targeted. He returned to his janitor's closet that evening and pulled her file. She'd received a Top Innovator award last quarter. No complaints. No flags. Until last week when she submitted a report that was now mysteriously flagged for review. By who? Jay scanned deeper. It was Brad. The same man who joked about speaking Swahili. Brad had escalated her for technical overreach and redundancy. Jay cross-referenced the project. Brad wasn't even involved. It was sabotage. And it was working. It started as a simple request, just another favor masked as authority. Julian, still under the alias of Jay Carter, was told by his department head to stay late and clean up after a team-building meeting on the 14th floor. You don't mind, do you? The manager, a man named Steve Harmon, asked without looking up. This is more your kind of work, anyway. Julian didn't answer. He just nodded, took the keycard, and headed upstairs with a broom and a quiet fire simmering behind his ribs. The room was a mess. Empty pizza boxes, half-drunk sodas, used markers, a projector still humming. Julian moved silently, collecting the trash as voices filtered in from the hallway. Steve entered with two other white managers, laughing loudly, beers in hand even though alcohol wasn't allowed on site. When they saw Julian still cleaning, they didn't pause, they got louder. "Well, look at that," Steve said. "Our in-house janitor/motivational mascot. Bet he's writing a TED Talk in his head right now." Julian didn't look at them. Just kept sweeping. But Steve wasn't done. He stepped closer. "Hey, Jay. Lighten up. You should smile more, man. Black guys always look so angry." Julian froze for half a second, broom in hand, then continued sweeping. His silence, as always, was misread as submission. Steve took a long sip of his beer, then suddenly, without warning, tilted the open can forward and poured the rest directly over Julian's head. The cold splash hit with the force of a slap. Julian's shoulders stiffened. The room went still for a beat. The other two men chuckled uneasily, unsure whether this was still a joke or something else entirely. Steve took a step back, smirking. "There," he said. "Now you look refreshed. Consider it a diversity bonus." The room was spinning now, not physically, but morally. Julian stood upright. Slowly. The soda ran down his neck, soaking his collar, dripping from his chin. His face remained calm. But his eyes were burning. And Steve saw it too late. That moment, the humiliation, the smirk, the soda soaking into the last shred of dignity, was the final fracture. Julian didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply stared straight into Steve's eyes and said, in the calmest voice he had ever used, "You just ended your career. You just don't know it yet." Steve laughed awkwardly. "What's that supposed to mean? You gonna file a report to HR? Please." Julian stepped forward, just close enough to whisper. "No. I'm going to bury everything you've built. And I'll do it without raising my voice." Then he picked up his broom, walked past the stunned men, and disappeared down the hallway, dripping, steaming, unbroken. By the next morning, Steve Harmon's name was already flagged on 3 pending investigations. And by the end of the week, the building would know what happens when you pour disrespect on the wrong man. That night, Julian Carter, the real Julian, sat on the floor of his apartment surrounded by flash drives, notebooks, printed chat logs, and audio files. He was tired. Not just from lifting boxes, but from pretending to be what they expected: invisible, obedient, disposable. He looked at a photo on his phone, his father, Solomon Carter, standing proudly at the opening ceremony of the first Carter Tech Lab, 20 years ago. Julian remembered what his father had whispered to him that day. "They will try to erase you. But they can't. Not if you remember who you are." Julian put the phone down. And wrote one final note in his journal that night. "They think they're cleaning house. But they're only building a bonfire. And I'm holding the match." Julian sat alone in the warehouse stairwell, the hum of distant forklifts echoing below him. A dull light flickered above his head as he stared at a single name printed on the page in his lap. Edward Langston. He whispered it out loud, letting the syllables roll bitterly across his tongue like sour wine. His uncle. His late mother's older brother. The man who'd helped raise him when his father passed. The man who'd once taken him fishing, taught him how to negotiate a car lease, how to speak softly in boardrooms full of wolves. And now he was the one orchestrating this. It wasn't just racist employees acting on their own. This was systemic. Organized. Directed. And at the center was Edward. Julian still remembered their last real conversation nearly a year ago. It was in the executive lounge at Carter Tech's annual retreat in Aspen. Snow falling gently outside, brandy warming in their glasses. Edward had leaned in close and said, "You've done well, Jules. Better than any of us imagined. But don't forget, this company was never meant to look the way it does now." Julian had brushed it off as generational discomfort. The kind of talk older white executives murmured when they thought diversity had gone too far. But now, he understood. Edward hadn't been uncomfortable. He'd been plotting. The deeper Julian dug, the darker it got. Over the next week, he used every backdoor access key he'd ever embedded into the Carter Tech system, tools meant for cybersecurity audits, now repurposed for a personal investigation. Financial records showed subtle reallocations of funds, training budgets for minority recruitment quietly rerouted to vague, internal development programs. Exit interview forms for black employees were modified or deleted entirely within 72 hours of submission. Even worse, bonuses. White managers within the Liberty Circle had received quarterly bonuses nearly 17% higher than their peers. And every time a high-performing black employee was removed or replaced, those managers were rewarded within the same fiscal month. And Edward? He was listed as executive sponsor for a shadow program titled Cultural Realignment Initiative. It sounded harmless. Even progressive. But the results spoke louder than the label. Of the 43 employees listed under that program over the past 9 months, 38 were people of color. 32 had been terminated. 6 had resigned under personal pressure. Julian felt like he was choking. He had built this company with his name, his sweat, his vision. Carter Tech was supposed to be the place where innovation didn't depend on skin color, where brilliance mattered more than background. But in his absence, or perhaps under his blind trust, it had become a machine for quiet erasure. Then came the moment that broke him. Late one night, Julian was reviewing archived security footage. He'd accessed the executive wing's private camera bank, the kind only 2 people in the company had access to, the CTO, and himself. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a sense of movement. Who was meeting with whom? What kind of patterns emerged? At 11:03 p.m. on a Friday, something appeared. Edward Langston, inside Julian's own office. Not a casual visit. He was standing behind the CEO's desk, Julian's desk, smoking a cigar. A glass of scotch in his hand. He was alone. Or so he thought. Julian watched, transfixed. Edward slowly walked around the desk, dragging his fingers across the surface. Then he sat in the CEO chair, leaned back, and sighed. Then, to no one but himself, he said, "All of this should have been mine." Julian's breath caught in his throat. Edward chuckled. Solomon always said the future needed new blood. But what he meant was black blood. He took a sip of scotch. And look where that's gotten us. Leaks. Lawsuits. Quotas. This company needs pruning, and I'm the gardener. Julian slammed his laptop shut that he couldn't watch anymore. He wanted to scream. Break something. Drive straight to the mansion in Buckhead where his uncle lived and drag him out by his silk collar. But he couldn't, not yet, not without finishing what he started. The next morning, Julian showed up to work early. Earlier than usual. He wasn't sleeping much anyway. Doug, the warehouse manager, handed him a new assignment. Edward Langston wants you moved upstairs for a week. They're short-staffed on document control. Guess he liked your hustle. Julian blinked. Mr. Langston requested that. Doug shrugged. I don't ask questions. Just follow the memo. That made no sense. Julian had made a point to blend in, stay under the radar. Why would Edward suddenly pull him closer? Unless Edward suspected something. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, everything changed. Gone were the dusty crates and industrial lighting. Here, the floors gleamed. The air smelled like lavender and espresso. Voices were softer. Smiles more artificial. Julian walked through the hallway like a ghost. No one greeted him. No one made eye contact. But he heard it. A whisper, "That's the temp Langston mentioned. Supposed to be sharp. Weird vibe though. Yeah, keeps to himself. But Doug says he works hard." They were watching him. He was given a cubicle near the executive filing servers. It looked like a promotion. But it was a cage. Every movement he made was monitored. His keycard access was restricted. Even the coffee machine required a PIN code. Still, he played the part, smiled when spoken to. Answered only when asked. Never challenged. Never flinched, and all the while, he listened. The more he listened, the clearer it became, Edward wasn't just trying to remove black employees. He was trying to force Julian out, legally, quietly. He was building a case, one of incompetence, mismanagement, and irreparable cultural rift. With enough staged HR issues, and just the right whisper campaign, the board could be persuaded to vote Julian out as CEO. Especially if the new guy quietly collected dirt from the inside, not knowing he was Julian himself. Julian realized the cruel irony. He was unknowingly being used in Edward's plan, to betray himself. But what Edward didn't know was that every whisper, every slur, every secret, was already in Julian's hands. That night, Julian returned to his apartment and opened the final flash drive, one he'd been saving for a moment like this. It contained the will of his father, Solomon Carter. The founding document of Carter Tech. And in it, a single clause stood out. In the event of a hostile corporate act aimed at the removal of the founding CEO due to reasons unrelated to measurable performance, the board shall be suspended under Article 9, pending legal arbitration and third-party audit. A clause Edward had forgotten. Because Edward had never built this company. He had only ever planned to steal it. Julian leaned back, the fire in his chest growing hotter. He whispered to himself, almost laughing now. "You taught me how to survive, Uncle, but not how to surrender." He clicked open his folders, Confession 001 through 004. Plus dozens more. It was time to stop collecting. It was time to act. By the end of week 3, Jay Carter had officially become part of the furniture present, unnoticed, underestimated. Just another low-level worker who kept his head down and followed orders. Exactly what they wanted. And exactly what Julian Carter needed. But what none of them realized was that silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. Julian had built a digital vault, an airtight case filled with audio recordings, leaked documents, surveillance footage, and internal memos. He had every slur. Every lie. Every policy disguised as realignment. The evidence against Edward Langston was now overwhelming. But there was one thing missing. A face. A moment. A public fracture. Julian didn't want a secret takedown. He wanted the rot exposed under fluorescent lights and watchful eyes. He needed the company to witness its own sickness. That moment came faster than he expected. It started as a casual morning meeting on the 12th floor. Julian had been assigned to assist a presentation on logistics software integration, purely observational. He wasn't allowed to speak, just set up the laptops, arrange folders, and make coffee. The presenter was Brad Kinsey, the same man who had made racist jokes in the break room and sabotaged Ava Gaines' career with a fake misconduct report. As Julian entered the room carrying a tray of fresh coffee cups, Brad greeted him with a mock salute. "Well, look who it is. The delivery man of the hour." Laughter followed. Mostly polite. Mostly uncomfortable. Julian gave a nod and placed the tray on the table. He was about to step back when Brad stopped him. "Hey Jay, since you're already here, can you take notes too? You know, make yourself useful." Julian looked him in the eye. "I wasn't given that task, sir." Brad tilted his head, enjoying the power play. "Right. I forgot. You're too educated for that. Horizon Solutions, right? Real Ivy League stuff there." More laughter. Julian said nothing, but Brad wasn't done. He turned to the room. You know, it's funny. We keep hiring guys like him and calling it equity, but I still have to explain the difference between a USB-A and a USB-C every damn day. One of the junior staff members chuckled. Another stared at her shoes. No one said a word. Brad turned to Julian, who was now holding a folder under his arm. Hey, are you recording this? Julian blinked. Excuse me? Brad stepped closer. I asked if you're recording. Because you people love catching white folks slipping, right? Silence fell across the room. And then, as if choreographed, Brad snatched the folder from Julian's hand and flung it across the table. Pages scattered. A file slid onto the floor. Julian bent down slowly to retrieve it. When he stood, his face was calm. Still. But inside, something had cracked. He looked Brad in the eye and said, softly, "Do you feel taller when you talk down to people?" Brad blinked. What did you just say? I asked, Julian repeated, if humiliating others makes you feel more important. Or just more afraid. Brad laughed. But there was no humor in it. You don't get to talk to me like that, he barked. You're lucky we even hired you. You think you're safe here because of quotas? Newsflash, this isn't a social experiment. It's a business. Julian's eyes were calm. Then it should concern you how poorly it's being run. Brad turned red. That's it. You're done. You're officially out of line. Security's going to escort you out right now. And he meant it. Because 2 minutes later, 2 uniformed security guards stepped into the room. Everyone watched. N01 moved. N01 spoke up. Julian was treated like a threat. A problem. A black man who forgot his place. The guards didn't ask questions. They grabbed him by the arm and walked him down 12 floors, past offices he had designed, past employees who once called him, sir, past the portrait of him in the lobby now conveniently removed for remodeling. No warnings. No hearing. No explanation, just humiliation. Back in the warehouse later that day, word had already spread. Did you hear? Mason said to Doug. The temp mouthed off in front of Brad. Got hauled out like a damn criminal. Doug smirked. Should have known. Smart mouth, quiet eyes. I knew he'd snap eventually. What a waste. Wonder who's next. Julian didn't go home. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He went straight to the parking garage, opened the trunk of a black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows, and pulled out a sleek black case. Inside were 2 things, a tailored charcoal gray suit with his initials embroidered inside the cuff, and a presentation clicker. He changed clothes in the back seat. Then he made a call. At 6:05 p.m., the emergency boardroom lights flickered on. The entire Carter Tech Executive Committee had been summoned for a surprise closed-door meeting. Most thought it was about a rumored data breach. Others thought it was a merger announcement. But when the door opened, and Julian Carter walked in dressed like power, standing like vengeance, the room fell silent. Brad, sitting in the back corner, dropped his pen. Edward Langston's jaw visibly tightened. Julian walked to the head of the table. Calm. Controlled. But every step was thunder. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He simply placed the black flash drive on the table and said, "Play this." One of the assistants looked to Edward for instruction. Edward nodded, slowly. Go ahead. The first clip played. Brad's voice, crystal clear, said. I swear, we're gonna have to start speaking Ebonics just to run meetings. Gasps. The second clip followed. Edward's voice. All of this should have been mine. Carter Tech needs pruning, and I'm the gardener. No one breathed. Then Julian spoke, voice unwavering. You've heard the recordings. You've read the documents. You've seen the performance records, the manipulated HR data, the deleted exit interviews, the coded memos. He turned to face Edward. This company has been under silent siege. Not by outsiders, not by competitors, but by you. A man I once called family. Edward stood, trying to speak. Julian, this is outrageous. No, Julian cut him off. What's outrageous is what's been done in my name. While I sat in boardrooms trusting my team, you were building a system to erase people who looked like me. He turned to the board. I have evidence of racial targeting, financial misconduct, bribery from external vendors, and deliberate obstruction of company ethics policies. Silence. Julian leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. And now, I'm invoking Article 9 of the Founding Charter. A few of the older board members gasped. Edward's face went pale. Effective immediately, the board is suspended. All executive actions will be reviewed under third-party arbitration. And Edward Langston. Julian paused, you are under federal investigation. 2 federal agents in dark suits entered the room without a word. Edward's mouth opened, then closed that he said nothing as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Brad didn't move. No one did. Julian didn't celebrate that he simply walked out of the room, down the hallway, past the receptionist's desk, where the same woman who once didn't look up now stood and stared at him with wide eyes. He paused. Smiled softly. Hi. I'm Julian Carter. Then walked through the glass doors, as the building behind him shook with everything it refused to face for years. But he wasn't done. Not yet. They say power is loud, but sometimes, it walks into a room without saying a word, and suddenly everything stops. That's what happened the next morning at Carter Tech. People didn't speak it out loud, but it spread faster than gossip ever had before. The janitor. The temp. The guy who carried boxes and got yelled at by Brad in front of the entire team. He was the CEO that IT didn't feel real. Not to the warehouse crew who'd watched him mop floors without complaint. Not to the HR reps who walked past him without a glance. And definitely not to Mason, who was still trying to process the moment 2 federal agents escorted Edward Langston, the man who had promised him a promotion, out of the building in handcuffs. The silence across the building was thicker than the humidity that July morning. And then, just before noon, a single email hit every employee inbox. Subject line, company-wide address, 1 p.m., Conference Hall A. From Julian E. Carter. Some thought it was a mistake. Others thought it was some cruel joke. But when the elevators opened, and Julian walked out, this time in a tailored navy suit, not a dusty warehouse uniform, the air shifted. Not because of the clothing, but because of the posture. The presence. He wasn't hunched or hiding anymore. He walked like a man who knew exactly where he was, and why he came back. The conference hall filled quickly. Standing room only. People who had never shown up to team meetings suddenly pressed themselves against the back wall, waiting. Watching. On the stage, there were no flags. No slides. No overproduced music. Just Julian. He stepped forward. Calm. Composed. Hands folded in front of him. And when he spoke, his voice was steady. Almost too quiet at first. Like he was talking to each person individually. I know many of you are confused. Some of you are angry. A few of you, scared. He let the word settle. I came back not to remind you of who I am, but to remind you of what this company was supposed to be. There was no need for applause. He wasn't performing. He was unearthing something buried. When I started Carter Tech, it was from a 1-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, with a broken laptop, a chipped mug, and a belief that brilliance should never have to apologize for where it came from. He paused, eyes scanning the room. Some looked down. Others looked directly at him, wide-eyed. But somewhere along the way, something broke. And then, for the first time, his voice hardened. Somewhere along the way, we allowed privilege to masquerade as merit. Allowed whispers and private chats to make decisions louder than resumes. We dressed racism in HR policy. We disguised fear as feedback. And we let people walk out those doors talented, loyal, brilliant people because they didn't look the way someone thought they should. The silence deepened. You could hear breaths being held. I saw it from the shadows. I heard the jokes. I read the files. I carried the boxes, mopped the floors, listened in the break rooms. And yes, I was the one who got dragged out by security like a criminal, in my own building. A rustle moved through the room. No one knew where to look. I let it happen, he continued. Because I needed to see it. Not from the top floor. But from the bottom. Where the truth lives. He walked to the edge of the stage. And now I'm standing here, not to seek revenge. But to rebuild. People leaned in. I'm announcing today the formation of an internal ethics review board independent from the executive team to investigate every firing, every demotion, every HR complaint from the last 12 months. Starting with the names you all remember, and the ones you conveniently forgot. There was a shift in the back of the room. Some stood straighter. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. To the black engineers who were pushed out, your names were never a threat. Your brilliance was never a mistake. To the interns who were ignored. To the assistants who were talked over. To the developers who trained others only to be passed over for promotions. He drew a breath. You were never invisible. They just weren't looking. He let that sit. Let the weight of it press against the walls. And as for those who stood by and laughed, who watched and whispered, who thought the temp in khakis couldn't possibly matter, this is your moment to reflect. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. Because guilt wears its own name tag. Julian took one final step forward. There are people who will leave this building today. Some by choice. Others by force. But for those who remain, if you're here to work, to grow, to build something better, I will fight for you. And then, his tone softened, because I remember what it's like to be the only one in the room. I remember being seen as the exception instead of the example. And I know what it's like to wonder if your voice is ever enough. He let that final sentence hang. Then he stepped back and walked off stage. No music. No applause, just silence, and reflection. That afternoon, Brad Kinsey was called into a private meeting with legal. By sunset, he'd been walked out with a cardboard box and a trembling hand. Mason found his desk locked and his credentials disabled. The promotion he was promised? Gone. Doug resigned before the investigation reached his floor. His name already appeared on the list for prioritized review. And as for Ava Gaines, the young systems engineer who had almost been sabotaged out of the company, she received an email directly from Julian's office. A full restoration of her role. Back pay. And an invitation to join the new ethics board as technical advisor. She cried when she read it. Not because of the promotion. But because someone had finally seen her. Later that week, Julian stood at the roof of the building just past sunset, a cup of black coffee in hand. The city buzzed below, unaware of the storm that had just passed over this tower of steel and glass. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt exhausted. Because justice wasn't always fireworks. Sometimes, it was quiet. It was walking through hell with your mouth closed and your eyes open, so when the moment came, your truth didn't need to shout. It simply stood. 2 weeks after the revelation, Carter Tech didn't look different on the surface, but under the skin, the whole organism had shifted. There were no dramatic overhauls. No giant banners hung in the lobby saying, "New Era." No ceremonial speeches or marketing stunts to paint over the past. Julian didn't believe in performance redemption. He believed in truth. In consequence. And now, consequence was rippling through every department like silent waves tearing off the wallpaper of pretense. One by one, the bad actors were gone. Some fired. Some exposed. Some too ashamed to face the weight of their own decisions. In HR, Carla had been replaced by a younger woman named Imani Clark Sharp, composed, and known for her relentless ethics work in employee advocacy. The Diversity Council, once a performative checkbox, was now a funded, independent body with subpoena power to request internal documents, reports, and even executive correspondence. Julian had written that clause himself. Ava Gaines, once a frightened engineer ready to resign, now sat at the center of that council, her calm voice carrying more weight than half the board ever had. The Liberty Circle chat group had been permanently dismantled. But its history was never deleted. Instead, printed transcripts were stored in a confidential archive labeled Accountability 2025. Julian didn't want revenge. He wanted memory. He wanted the company to remember what it allowed. What it ignored. What it laughed at behind closed doors. On the surface, his return looked like power being restored. But that was never the goal. He didn't want to just return, he wanted to redefine. So he instituted mandatory bias audits every quarter, not just for hiring but for promotions, raises, team feedback, and even internal communication language. Anonymous reporting systems were redesigned and encrypted, with external auditors validating each case. Julian paid for the system himself. He refused to let budget be an excuse for moral failure. Still, not everyone welcomed the changes. A few executives bristled. They missed the bold culture, whispered in elevators that this was too much, that we've gone too far. But they never said it out loud, not anymore. Because they had learned the most dangerous lesson of all: silence could cost you more than speaking. And Julian? He didn't argue with them. He didn't fight back in meetings or play games of corporate chess. He just looked them in the eye and they looked away. Because they remembered the janitor. And now, they saw the king. But it wasn't just about Carter Tech. Julian took the story outside the building too. Not through tabloids or dramatic interviews. He declined every major outlet that offered to tell his journey. Instead, he published a single open letter on the Carter Tech website titled, "We Didn't See It. Now We Must." It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a press stunt. It was a mirror. In the letter, he wrote, "We often mistake success as a shield from injustice. But racism doesn't need permission. It finds cracks in every castle. And sometimes, it wears a suit just like yours." The letter went viral. Shared by CEOs, activists, educators, interns. It became mandatory reading at 3 business schools by the end of the month. Julian didn't comment. He let the story speak for itself. Let the silence do its job. One rainy evening, Julian stood outside the building just after a late board session. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for one figure standing under the awning, an older black man in a delivery uniform. Julian nodded at him as he passed. The man looked up, paused, and then said, "You the boss here?" Julian smiled. "Some days." The man hesitated, then added, "My son applied here last year. Didn't get a call back. But last week, he got an email to reapply. Said the whole process changed. Said, it felt fair." Julian looked the man in the eye, his voice low. "Tell him to come back. We're building something different now." The man smiled. "About time." Julian watched him drive off, tail lights fading into the mist. For the first time in months, he let himself exhale, not with pride, but with peace. Because justice wasn't a finish line. It was a foundation. And now, finally, it was in place. Not perfect. Not permanent. But undeniable. He turned toward the building, his building where he had once been dragged out like a criminal in front of people who didn't know his name. Now, they knew. Not because he told them. but because he showed them. He never raised his voice. He never demanded respect. He just became the evidence. And when history asked who changed Carter Tech, they wouldn't point to a scandal. They would point to a man in silence, with dust on his boots, fire in his chest, and no apology in his eyes. Sometimes, the most powerful move isn't a scream. It's staying quiet long enough to gather truth, to let injustice speak for itself, than walking into the room and letting who you are say the rest. Julian Carter didn't win by shouting louder. He won by listening longer, by observing deeper, and by refusing to stoop to the level of those who tried to erase him. This story isn't just about corporate racism. It's about how systems survive on silence, and how change begins the moment one person decides not to be invisible anymore. Whether you're in a boardroom, a break room, or just trying to survive the space you're in, your presence matters. Your silence has weight. But so does your choice to break it. So ask yourself today, are you standing by, or are you standing up? If this story struck a chord in you, share it. Speak it. Let it move through your circle, because the more we name injustice, the harder it is for it to hide. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Julian's shoes? And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories of silent power, hard truths, and justice without apology. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more witnesses.